and is our lead chemist for PFAS analysis, and Kat's going to talk about addressing extraction challenges for PFAS. Oh yeah, Ali's recording the meeting, and I did not ask Mark or Janice about recording, so let me do that right now. If there's an issue with, if you'd prefer not to be recorded, please say so either right now or at the end of your talk. And Kat, take it away. If you have a screen to share, go for it.
Will do. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly show you who I was. I'm going to stop my video here just to conserve bandwidth, but I did want to just say hello virtually before turning off my camera. And let's see, I can share that and that. Can everyone see, can you see my screen?
I can.
Awesome, great. All right, let's get started. So my name is Katrin Williams. I am a research scientist too here at the DEC. Specifically, I'm in the Bureau of Ecosystem Health. And as Wayne said, I do PFAS work, primarily looking at contamination in wildlife tissue. And my email is listed there. It's also going to be at the end, just in case you didn't grab it here. So I work at a small little building called the Hale Creek Field Station, which is near Albany on the eastern side of New York. We're relatively small. We've got about 15 people at the lab, but we do really good work, and it's a beautiful scenic area. Love the lab. I love where we're located. And we have been around since 1979, and we have always been a multidisciplinary research facility. We've done a lot of work since the 1970s on a variety of different contaminants. And like I said previously, we primarily do this on various wildlife tissue, especially fish. And what we do is we look at fish from all over New York State water bodies, including and wildlife as well, that also qualifies. I also wanted to just briefly mention that every year we have a Hale Creek Field Day. So you can see one of my coworkers actually there in our fish ponds that are no longer used as hatcheries, but we use them for educational purposes. So we do that every year to kind of show the students, you know, fish and what we do here. So it's really cool. We have three primary different analyses that we do here at Hale Creek. The first two up top are ones that have been in place for quite a long time. We have the organics branch, which is what we term organics, and that's primarily what we do there is analyze for PCBs, legacy pesticides such as DDT. We also then have metals. Right now we're just looking at mercury, but we are setting up to look at a variety of different things or different metals with ICP-MS availability. And then finally, the most recent addition to our triad is PFAS, which is what I was hired on to do. So I want to just briefly mention the compounds that we quantitate for and those that are qualitative currently in our analysis. I know that this might not be as plentiful of a list as other labs might be, but this suits our initial purpose, which was to kind of get the ball rolling. And we hope to add on a lot more compounds, you know, as we progress and you know, those PFAS that make sense to look at in fish and other wildlife tissue. We have method detection limits of 1 to 2 nanograms per gram, depending on the analyte. You'll notice 2 of them are missing, PFBA and PFPEA, as I will mention later on in this talk, and as I'm sure for those people who work in the labs on PFAS are abundantly aware, contamination is a big issue, especially in my case for PFBA and PFPEA. However, I feel like we've actually gotten to a point where we may yet be able to add these back into the method, hopefully by the end of the year. So just some brief statistics. We've been in production since December of 2019. We've completed just under 780 samples to date, and our capability is estimated to be somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500, depending on instrumental issues and you know, numbers of projects that we can fit in. And I do want to say a brief note that this lab is not ELAB certified, so a lot of the certification processes or a lot of the restrictions that apply to ELAB, you know, don't necessarily apply to us. Right. So I'm going to just kind of give a brief overview. For some of you, I'm sure this is review, but I know not everyone works in a lab. So I did want to kind of briefly discuss the kind of orders, you know, of the process, kind of from the day you get the fish to the lab to the number in your report, how that happens. So in our case, our analyte is our compound of interest, that's PFAS. For example, that chemical structure is PFAS. And we want to remove it from our sample or matrix, which in our case typically is fish. Unfortunately, we don't yet have an instrument that we can just take a chunk of fish and put it on the instrument and spit out a number for how much PFAS we have. So we have to do some manipulation to the sample to get it where we need to be. And that first step is to remove the analyte from the sample. Then once that is the case, once we've done that, we then remove all of the other stuff that we removed along with our compounds of interest. We separate the analyte from those other compounds to make it nice and clean and pretty for our very expensive analytical instrumentation, which will then tell us exactly how much of that analyte was in our sample to begin with. So with extraction. And I also, in extraction, we use something called isotopic dilution. I'm sure you've probably heard of this before, but if not, what we do is we add in an isotopically labeled analog of the compound. And a good example is listed here. So the top is PFAS as it normally occurs, and the bottom is a structure that you can get from a lab. We typically use Wellington. And these are pretty much behave exactly the same way in your sample. The only difference is it has a carbon that's not a carbon 12, it's a carbon 13. Normally you need more than one. You can also have, instead of hydrogen, you can have deuterium or oxygen 18 instead of oxygen 16. Basically, it's just a way to get the mass difference between PFAS, for example, and M8 PFAS. Basically, there's enough of a mass difference here that you'll be able to tell them apart once you actually get to the analytical side of things. But from the extraction through cleanup steps, they behave identically, which is exactly what we want. And I figured the best way to potentially explain how these work is to talk about them in terms of fish. So let's move to the next slide. These final two, the middle and the right-hand side, are kind of like what I like to think of as isotopic dilution. What we do is at the very start of the extraction, we add in our isotopically labeled analogs. So those are like the carbon 13s, the deuteriums, the oxygen 18s. We add those into our sample and kind of let them mix with the sample, in our case, some homogenized fish tissue. And we let them kind of bind with the tissue, and then we extract them back out. And the lovely thing is we can then use the labeled compounds as a benchmark. So that kind of helps us with accuracy throughout the method. PFAS are kind of tricky to extract reliably out of samples. So isotopic dilution is kind of a way to help kind of normalize the process and make it so things remain more consistent. I also want to briefly mention pH. As analytical chemists, we kind of look for any ways that we can to kind of manipulate the sample to remove just the analyte and only the analyte as much as possible, while keeping every other component of your sample in the sample. And pH is one way to do that. We are lucky enough that, at least for our current compound list, all but one compound have negative charge under environmental conditions, because they're the hydrogens that they have on their certain functional groups are just so willing to be donated that they become anions, the compounds themselves. So that helps us with breaking up hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds that form when these compounds are exposed to proteins, which is what happens. PFAS, typically you find them binding to proteins quite a bit, which is not good for us when we talk about extraction. So we add, in our lab, we add a base to our solvent to help remove the hydrogen bonding and the ionic bonding parameters, so that PFAS is a little bit more ready to come out into the solvent rather than staying attached to the fish tissue. Okay, let's move on to cleanup. And this is where now we've got a solution with not only your compounds of interest, but now you've got a lot of other fish stuff in it. You could just analyze this sample right here. However, it will not get you very far. Your your analytical instrumentation will not like you, and your very, very expensive equipment may not last all that long. So it's best to do some kind of cleanup to your sample to kind of remove as much proteins, lipids, other compounds that you may have co-extracted out, so your sample pretty much only hopefully contains your analytes and maybe a few other things. And these are just some of the different cleanup methods that are possible for PFAS analysis. We use all three of these in our extraction procedure. So I'm going to talk about ENVI-Carb first on the left. You may know that for water filtration, PFAS is removed from water using GAC, or granular activated carbon. And that presents, as you can see in the very bottom left here, as porous holes in carbon, so it's also activated carbon. The lovely thing about ENVI-Carb is it's graphitized kind of sheets of carbon instead of pores. So the pores of the porous activated carbon will actually grab onto PFAS very, very well. That's why they're used. If they're presented in sheets, however, that doesn't happen. It's really kind of cool. Everything else will get grabbed into that activated carbon if it's ENVI-Carb in specific, but leave the PFAS alone, which is really kind of neat. So that kind of might help that disconnect of, well, if I'm using activated carbon, isn't that bad? But not if it's in the, like I said, if it's in the sheets instead of GAC. In the center, you may or may not have heard of solid phase extraction. This is kind of our bread and butter of PFAS cleanup. And it basically does exactly as the schematic says. We add our sample, we wash to remove some interference out, and then when we're ready, we use a different elution solvent to remove our compounds of interest. In that gray area are a bunch of little particles that have a lot of sticky, grabby arms. I like to think of it as like a koosh ball. And as your compounds go through, those little koosh arms sticky arms will grab onto your compounds, and they'll want to hold on instead of going through to waste, as for example, the stars do in the second line. It's only when you use a solvent that they would prefer to be in your analytes of interest versus the sticky arms that they'll actually come off the column, and now you have collected in a vial your compounds of interest, separated from all of the other triangles and rectangles and circles, etc. And finally, as an important step, filtration is pretty much necessary whenever you are working with, again, expensive analytical instrumentation. Something as simple as filtering your sample before putting it on could mean the difference between spending thousands of dollars in columns and maintenance costs on your instrument versus not as much if you filter your samples beforehand. Okay. And finally, we'll mention analysis. So now we get to the fun part, at least for me. This is where I spend the majority of my time now that the method has been developed. Up until this point, this is done by a technician that we hired to do that work, and he does a fantastic job. This is where I spend most of my time, and this is a liquid chromatography mass spectrometry unit. I'm sure you've probably heard it mentioned, but I did want to kind of just briefly break it down. The liquid chromatography part, that comes first. That part, it basically almost works like SPE. You're separating your compounds from one another, however. So you still have those little sticky, grabby arms in a column. However, now you're looking to just basically separate your compounds from one another. We do that to kind of help out our detector, our mass spec, so you can more adequately and accurately detect everything as it's going through the detector. So the LC part separates the compounds from one another, and the mass spectrometer detects the compounds. I'd be happy to go in more detail with you if you would like to know more about that. I spent a lot of time in grad school working on the theories behind mass spec, but I will leave that for another day. Simply to suffice, just to say, here is a chromatogram of our PFAS. So it works, it's lovely. Our compounds are mostly separated and look great. And some brief details are listed above. We have a longer runtime in comparison to potentially like a private run lab, but I like to do that to make sure that everything is adequately separated, and we still analyze our samples in more than enough time. And our calibration range is from 0.1 to 500 nanograms per mil, which is a decent range. We've only had a few instances where we've had a particular compound higher than 500 nanogram per mil. And spoiler alert, it was PFAS. PFOS was higher than that in a couple instances, but the most part, that calibration range has worked well for us. So it is not as we get to this point, and I say it's not as nearly as easy as it appears. I spent 2 years working on this method. It likely would have been easier, but of course there always are complications when you're doing method development. The first one that I will mention is interference. So if we're analyzing PFAS in a matrix like water, that's pretty straightforward. Even if it's groundwater, there probably aren't a whole lot of other things in the water to really cause a problem with our compounds. However, when you get into more complicated matrices like soil or biosolids or tissue, you can start to have problems. So for instance, because we look at tissue, there is one interferent out there that is specifically a problem for PFAS because it has the exact same mass nearabouts as PFAS, and it also has a similar functional group circled. And this is a bile acid. There's actually a suite of bile acids. They're all called TDCAs, taurodeoxycholic acid. Yes, I said it correctly. Sorry. And these are present routinely in tissue samples. You see them more in viscera. However, they all are also present in muscle tissue as well. You compare a fish extract to a standard. At the top is the transition, basically the analytical monitoring transition that they both share. The middle row is PFAS transition only, and TDCA is at the bottom. I say transition, and suffice it, basically what happens there is a parent ion and a product ion. If you have both, that means that it's likely your compound of interest. So the first number listed is your parent, second number is your product or your daughter ion, basically. So 499 to 80 is something shared by both PFAS and TDCA. And as you can see in the fish extract side, that yellow peak up at the top is actually TDCA, where we monitor for it only using a different transition that PFAS does not have. You can see it pop up right away. So unless you were to know that this is what you're looking for, TDCA, that could cause a problem, because this transition in particular, 499 to 80, is the one that we use to actually quantitate our samples. So if these compounds were not chromatographically separated, and by that I mean, so if the LC didn't come into play, if this was just the PFAS peak was laid over top of the TDCA peak, that would be a problem, because we wouldn't be able to necessarily differentiate that as compared to the standard, where TDCA does not show up at all. So the LC is a vital component here, and different columns will give you different results, but obviously the interference can be an issue. There are a couple other compounds that this applies to as well, but the TDCA and PFAS is the most well known. Also, as I mentioned earlier, contamination is a big problem. I'm sure you've heard loads about this if you have anything to do with PFAS. Teflon tubing, lubricants, solvents, personal clothing, basically anything could be fair game as far as what could be causing contamination in your lab. We routinely test new material, new lots, new solvents. Some labs even have to test different bottles of methanol, even if they're in the same lot, that potentially bottle to bottle there could be differences. And there was a study done by Denley et al. In 2019, going through and kind of figuring out where some contamination was coming from, primarily for water sampling, but it still is applicable to our lab work. So it's just interesting to know about. PTFE tubing, it's fluorinated, so it makes sense that there may be contaminants coming from that tubing, and sure enough, we do see PFBA and PFPEA coming from PTFE tubing, or rather they did. Same with LDP PE tubing. And sample labels, sometimes those could potentially be an issue as well. These are all results that were reported in their paper that came out in 2019. I did want to briefly mention kind of an anecdote from our lab, which we actually recently solved earlier this year. As part of our cleanup process, we use a solution of ammonium acetate that we want to get to pH 4. And so the way that we would do that is we would make up the solution in a volumetric flask, titrate the solution to pH 4 by adding some acid normally, and then filtering the solution, as you can see here on the upper right-hand side, and collecting it in an Erlenmeyer flask, and then we're ready to go with sample cleanup. However, we were noticing over time that PFBA concentrations were starting to go insanely high, like over 100 nanograms per gram apparent in our samples and in our method blanks included, which was that's incredibly high. And we finally narrowed it back down to this solution as causing the problem. So we decided to test pH titration versus filtration to see what was causing the problem, because we also use ammonium acetate in our mobile phase, we knew that itself was not the problem. It had to be something else, some manipulation that we were doing to the solution. So we spiked some samples and we measured their recovery using basically comparing when just using our method as is, the ammonium acetate solution without pH titrating. In other words, we just filtered it after we added acid, because by now we know about how much acid we need to add, so we would add the acid without titrating and filter it. And then finally, we also looked at the ammonium acetate solution that instead of filtering it, we just titrated the pH normally and then put it straight on to our cleanup system. And as you can see, we isolated the problem pretty quickly, and it ended up being the pH titration unit, which it might seem a little weird looking at it, but basically the system where we only did the pH titration and did not previously filter it, that was the problem, which is really interesting. I had never heard of a pH meter causing problems for PFBA, and to a lesser extent, PFPEA. Also was borne out in the method blank, which you can see in the table. Without filtration, it was 542 nanograms per gram versus with just using our method, it was 50. But without actually using the pH meter, it was back down to 3 nanograms per gram. That's actually lower than that since then. And PFPEA kind of had a similar thing happen to it. So we obviously no longer use the pH meter, and fortunately for us, this solution does not need to be as tightly controlled at pH 4 plus or minus 0.03, so we have allowed ourselves a little bit more leeway in the pH as long as it's approximately 4, and remove the pH meter from consideration, because obviously something in there was causing contamination. Who knew? I didn't know. We're still learning this as we go. And this kind of applies to a large host of different things, as I mentioned already. This could apply to personal care products, or Gore-Tex, especially now that it's raining here, Gore-Tex raincoats, or we have to test tubes routinely, or nitrile gloves, or aluminum foil. There is so much yet we do not understand. Fortunately, the more of us that do PFAS analysis, the more likelihood that's going to happen that we are actually going to have more PFAS-free certified materials likely pop up in the near future, which I'm very much looking forward to. And with that, I'd like to thank you and everyone at Hill Creek, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you, Kat. We'll have a couple of minutes for questions and move on to our guest speakers. Any questions?
What extraction technique do you actually use on the fish tissue?
So by that, we just use methanol with base in it. That's basically what we do. We use a strong base in our, there we go. We use, yeah, methanol and a strong base. And then we do sonicate, and then we shake overnight.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Another?
Hi, Catherine. Not a question, actually a comment. It was very nicely presented in a very simplified form for some of those complex analytical principles. So well done.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Another question. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much. If we have some more time at the end, I do have a couple of comments, but we'll save that. And thanks very much, Kat.
Thank you.
So next up, oh, good, great. So next up is Mark Mills, who is with EPA's Office of Research and Development, and he works on PFAS. And Mark's the first of two speakers from the federal government who are going to talk about developing a federal method for fish tissue. So Mark, if you'd like to introduce yourself a bit more or just take it away, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. One thing, we may flip-flop here, would have Janice go first. Janice, if you're available, just the way we had worked out this presentation, she was going to cover some materials first.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did I miss
that's
something?
fine.
Is that okay, Janice?
Yeah, that's fine. Can you pull up my slides for me?
Ooh. Let me see.
I don't believe my lovely government computer is going to let me do that today.
Okay, 1 second, my apologies.
Janice is with the Department of Defense. And if you want to just introduce yourself a bit also, please, that will be better than me trying to speak for you.
Oh, sure, no problem. So I work with NABC's Laboratory Quality Accreditation Office. They're the folks that are heavily involved in the environmental data quality work group that has basically authority over the DoD ELAP program for accreditation of laboratories. I also work heavily with the CERTIP ESCC program, and ITRC as well as co-chairing one of their PFAS sampling and analysis subgroups. That's in a nutshell. Basically, anything that's PFAS comes my way.
Great. Janice, I'm trying to find your presentation. 1 second. I just want to make sure I have the right version.
Okay.
And just to confirm, Janice and Mark, are you okay with it being recorded?
Sure, that's fine.
Yep.
Okay.
Everything's been cleared. Oh, here we go. Sorry. All right. It is loading, and I am sharing. Oh, I thought I was. All right. Janice, can you see the slides?
I can see the slides. Yeah, that's no problem. Are you going to be able to advance them for me?
I can, yes.
That'd be great. Okay, just go on to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to give you today is a brief description of the current DoD QSM requirements for tissue analysis and discuss existing tissue method variability as well as the DoD's 1600 series method initiative. Is it? I don't think it's advancing.
I can advance here.
Can you go to slide 3 for me?
It is. Are you seeing it?
It's not. It's not advancing.
I'm seeing DoD DOE consolidated QSM.
Okay. Well,
Yep.
Nobody else is. Yeah.
Are you seeing it now?
Nope.
No, the first slide. And it's also in like the slide showing view, not the presentation mode.
Okay, 1 second. I will
Try
stop.
resharing it. It might work.
I will.
And by the way, this is Jackie Fisher. I joined late. I saw Olive Cat's presentation though, so thank you.
Great. So
There
are
we
you
go.
seeing
Awesome.
slide 2?
There.
Yep. I see slide 2 now, so we can go to slide 3.
3?
Okay, awesome. Okay, perfect. Okay, the requirements for PFAS methods under DOD accreditation are the general requirements found throughout the QSM. Those all still apply for PFAS, as well as PFAS-specific requirements that are found in Appendix B, specifically in Table B15, and Appendix C, which has tables C44 and C45 that apply to PFAS. And go on to the next slide. Okay, the tables contained in Appendix B were created to promote consistency by providing a set of minimum quality control requirements for instances where multiple versions of a method exist. They also were created to address the shoulds in a method that DOD felt should be actually musts, and instances where no published methods are available, that's being the case with PFAS. A laboratory's ability to meet these requirements is evaluated during the DOD ELAP accreditation body assessments. And these tables are often used as the basis for project-specific method performance criteria, since if a lab is accredited for a method that falls under the requirements of a table, it's been shown that they can meet those requirements. They can achieve those quality control elements. But keep in mind, these are not methods. They only provide quality control criteria, not the processes to meet that criteria. Next slide. The other appendix, Appendix C, contains laboratory control sample matrix spike and matrix spike due control limits that are required to be met per the associated Table B. So for Table B15, you would go to, for the limits associated with the requirements in Table B15, you get a C44 and C45. The tables specific to PFAS were added to the appendix in 2018. They were included, the control limits included were generated from data provided by the DOD ELAP laboratories that were accredited for PFAS analysis at that time that were willing to share their information, and that ended up being 11 laboratories. The criteria for data for inclusion was that for a particular analyte in a particular media, we had to have received at least 100 records from at least 4 different laboratories. Because of this, we were only able to generate tables for aqueous and solid media. At the time the data was generated, which was roughly 2016-2017 timeframe, we only had 1 laboratory that was accredited for tissue analysis. Again, a laboratory's ability to meet these limits is assessed during accreditation, and also is used for method performance criteria as well in the future projects. Go ahead and change. Next slide. Okay, so Table B15 provides basic requirements for all media, such as requirements for spiking the sample with isotopic dilution standards or extracted internal standards, as we call them, prior to extraction, and the requirements for every sample that undergo a carton cleanup, such as the use of ENVI-Carb. The only requirement specific to biota is that samples are prepared, i.e. the whole sample received, or preparation of a fillet, for example. That is a project-specific requirement. It's not, we do not state how it's to be done in that table. We just defer to the project. So you can see far from a procedure is provided by these tables for tissue analysis. So we have limited information for aqueous and solid samples as well. Why are we okay with analyzing those and not really tissue analysis right now with the DOD? The reason is there's much greater variability in the biota sample results versus other media results due to the diverse processes laboratories use for preparing these samples. That's really the crux of it. This is not the case for aqueous and solid samples, as laboratories are fairly consistent in their preparation techniques, exhibiting very minor variation. Next slide. Some of the major causes of variability, as we know, there's no published EPA method for biota, but also sample extraction, cleanup, and analysis procedures cited in published research are not in agreement, which is where most of our labs get their starting point when developing their methods. So it's really all over the place because of that. There are also limited reference materials available and no PT or proficiency test studies that the laboratories can use to validate their methods. So that really creates a lot of problems, a lot of variability. Next slide. So to give you an idea of some of the variability we've seen from laboratory to laboratory and researcher to researcher, first is the holding times. They're really all over the place. Some default to the holding times of drinking water methods, while others extend it out up to 60 days. Storage is either refrigeration or freezing, and the amount of sample extracted and the process used for homogenation of the sample greatly varies from laboratory to laboratory as well. Next slide. But I think the biggest cause of variability in data results results from the differences in the extraction process used. Of particular concern is the differences in extraction solvent and its contact time with the sample, which ranges anywhere from I've seen it from as little as 20 minutes to 18 hours. The level of cleanup performed on the extracts varies from absolutely nothing, which I mean, I agree with everyone in that you're going to really shorten your lifespan of your instrumentation at that point, to carbon cleanup only, to SPE only, or a carbon SPE cleanup and also filtration added into it. As a result of the use of all of these different techniques, the precision and accuracy that's associated with these methods is very inconsistent. So you can see we really need a method that provides a detailed procedure at this point. Next slide. So that brings me to what DoD sees as the path forward, which is the 1600 series method that we are validating. This initiative is led and funded by the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, CERDIP. The project team consists of members of the CERDIP PFAS Working Group, which includes Mark and myself, and Dr. Andrea Leeson, who is the Deputy Director of CERDIP ESTCP. Also, it includes representatives from EPA's Office of Water and Office of Land and Emergency Management, OLM, and SGS Access, which is a DoD ELAP accredited laboratory. To date, CERDIP has obligated approximately $3 million and the EPA approximately $150,000 to this effort. This project's goal is to take a method created by SGS Access that was being considered by the EPA as the basis of an isotopic dilution method, modify it to meet DoD and EPA Office of Water requirements, validate the method through intra and inter-laboratory validation studies, and submit the whole enchilada to the EPA and for consideration as a 1600 series method. Why did we go this route and not an SW846 route? As was mentioned before, well, first it was at the suggestion of the Office of Water that we at the EPA that we go through the Office of Water route. They felt that it was most likely the quickest route to publication. There's also another more technical reason for this as well. Through development of this method, we found that there are certain steps, especially in the sample preparation, that cannot be modified. You may or may not, well, actually, what was stated before, the SW846 methods are guidance, whereas the Office of Water methods are prescriptive and modifications not permitted for many of the elements, especially when it comes to sample preparation. So we've engaged the EPA OLM and addressed their comments throughout the entire process as well, though, in hopes that along with it being considered as a 1600 series method, it will be considered as an SW846 method in the future as well. The media being evaluated is groundwater, surface water, wastewater, landfill leaching, soil, sediment, biosolids, and tissue. And it also includes a holding time study. The tissues included included in the study are low lipid fish, a high lipid fish, and clams. Next slide, please. All right, and here's the analyte list that's included for the validation study. Note I say validation study and not the method. We'll see how many successfully make it through the single lab validation study and end up in the method. I suspect given each media type presents their own unique set of challenges, the analyte list in the draft method will vary from media to media. you can see this list does not does not only include all the analytes in method 537.1 and 533 and SW846 method 8327. It also includes some additional analytes that were requested by Office of Water and OLA. Regardless of the performance in a single lab study, validation study, we plan to carry all of these 40 analytes into in our laboratory validation study as well. Next slide. Some of the basic principles of the method are for aqueous samples, it utilizes the entire sample collection, inclusion of bottle rinses to avoid the bias low results due to absorption onto the collection container walls, which is critical, especially now that we're evaluating really low concentrations in samples. It utilizes solid phase extraction using a wax cartridge and cleanup steps, and also includes a mechanism for addressing high PFAS concentration samples. So cleanup is obviously critical because we're seeing really high levels of interferences and also other PFAS analytes as well. For analysis, it utilizes LCMSMS and isotopic dilution quantitation and includes QC parameters consistent with those required by DoD ELAP and the Office of Water. The method attempts to include the evaluation of 40 PFAS using 24 extracted internal standards. So those are the isotopic dilution analog standards that of method 533. That's the same. That means the same thing. And injection and 7 injection internal standard analytes, which equates to isotope performance standards in method 533. Next slide. So some of the details of the tissue prep are as follows. We require a blank media of either a clean clean tissue or a 1090 mixture of canola oil and Ottawa sand to be used for the method blanks in the method, and the laboratory control samples or OPR samples. Samples are going to be stored at less than or equal to -20 degrees C for up to 1 year, and extracts are to be stored at less than 4 degrees C for up to 30 days. Extraction processes utilize up to 2 grams of a homogenized sample, and the samples are spiked with extracted internal standards prior to extraction. The homogenized 2-gram sample undergoes 3 cycles of extraction, the first one being the much more lengthy than the other two. At 16, there's a 16-hour, essentially an overnight extraction. So we have a lot of contact time with the extraction solvents, which we found to be absolutely critical. Next slide. Both carbon and SPE cleanup are required, and there's actually also a filtration step that's included. That's actually the carbon cleanup SPE, and the filtration step is included in all of for all of the matrices in the method. The carbon cleanup is required to be performed using the loose carbon, not the carbon cartridges. Carbon cartridges are actually prohibited because we found that the loose carbon does a much better job. The samples are concentrated following carbon cleanup, and the pH is adjusted prior to the wax SPE cleanup, which we found to be another critical step. I also wanted to mention that the method requires the analysis of a standard for that bile acid that was talked about earlier, TDCA, with each calibration curve. The TDCA is required to elute at a retention time that demonstrates complete separation from PFAS. It's shown to cause, as was noted, false positives of PFAS in tissues. Some people think that this is only applicable to a whole fish homogenized sample and doesn't apply to fillets, but it has been shown that it is problematic in fillets as well. The carbon does do a good job of getting a lot of it out, but it doesn't not get all of the TDCA out. So we felt that we still needed to have some way of monitoring TDCA in these samples and ensuring that the separation is there for the LC side of the house. Next slide. So since the single laboratory data collection is complete, and we are in the process of generating the study stats, I wanted to give you an idea of how the method's really looking. First, the limit of quantitation that's achievable ranges from 0.5 ppb for most analytes to 12.5 for two of the analytes that were requested to be added that aren't included in 533 or 537.1. The mean spike recoveries appear to all be within 70 to 130% recovery, except for just a handful of analytes. And while the mean recoveries show statistical differences between the three samples, the low lipid, high lipid, and the clams included in the study, they all stay within 100 to 120% recovery. So those are just some of the preliminary results that we have from the single lab study. We're really just right now diving a little bit deeper into the stats and taking a look at things. I will say the extracted internal standards look good, as well as the injection internal standard recoveries look good as well. So I don't see that we're going to, there's just a handful of analytes that we may have to look at dropping from the analyte list for this method, but there are not many. So we're fairly pleased with the outcome for tissue analysis. And so that's my fast and furious update, Mark.
Wow, thanks. That was fascinating. So, Mark, would you like to go ahead then? I think I'm finding this fascinating. This is a lot of great information for me. I think we are going to overrun our hour, though. So, if Mark, if you would just get started, and if folks can stay past 4 or 3, depending on where you are, and ask questions later. Mark? Huh.
Did we lose him?
I don't know. I'm seeing his symbol here. He's on mute. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Well, if anybody has a question in the meantime.
This is Pat. I don't have a question, but I just want to make a quick reminder to update the risk assessment benchmarks on SharePoint by May 13th. And just a reminder too that it's in Excel, so only one person can edit it at a time. So if you have issues, that might be the reason. Thanks.
And I just got a text from Mark. He is reconnecting. His internet had dropped, so he's
Okay, thanks.
trying to get back on.
So, I guess so. This is. I'm seeing a lot of complexity here as a non-chemist with what you've described, Janice. Is this? And I'm not really familiar with methods of many commercial labs. I mean, before Kat developed her method, we used SGS Access. Is this going to cause grief for many of the commercial labs that are trying to get into the PFAS analysis?
Not really. The method the 1600 series method is really based on the requirements that we had in our quality systems manual and our QSM already. So the transition to the requirements of this method are not going to be huge obstacles. You know, we're having 8 of our laboratories are participating in the multi-lab validation study, along with 2 state labs. And so, you know, I don't see there's going to be a huge hurdle for laboratories. They're going to have to, you know, somewhat tweak their processes. But for, you know, what I'm hoping is that once this is out there, we are going to have labs that do a much better job, you know, and are much more consistent with each other on tissue analysis. Especially, you know, that's like I said, that's the one that I really see way too much variability in how people are doing things.
Yeah. Which
So
I think
I don't think it's going to be that much of a problem for them.
That's good. That's a really good thing. I mean, for me, as much more on the end user side, I think it's really insightful to see how much goes into this and how much complexity there is, and sort of the things that you kind of need to know that your lab's doing correctly in order to have good data. I think as Mark did, something just changed. Oh, he's not here.
Yeah. So Mark's computer 100% crashed, and so he is going to be probably unable to get back on the call. So he sends his apologies, but he's thinking that, we need to, if you want to reschedule him at a different time to speak, he'd be willing to do that.
Okay, I guess we'll have to do that. So I really thanks to you. Does anyone else have questions for either Kat or for Janice?
I actually have a question for Janice. This is Pat. Thank you so much. This was incredibly useful, and I'm really looking forward to this method coming out. I did have a question. I don't know if you are able to speak any more to the mechanism for higher concentrations of PFAS in samples. You mentioned that briefly is kind of like built into the method. Are you able to kind of expand on that a little bit more?
Right. So one of the limitations, one of the things that I've gotten always really frustrated with, I tried to get it in the table P15 requirements, and I was unsuccessful in my attempt, was I really feel that labs need to screen samples. I believe that we should be sending them a smaller aliquot of samples when it's an aqueous sample, and for screening. And I feel that it's really a lab's due diligence to screen samples because of the potential for such high concentrations to really contaminate their entire system. It can cause a lot of problems with the solid phase extraction setup, and among other things. It can get hung up in your GC on your LCMS, and cause a lot of carryover issues and everything. So what we do is in the method we are requiring folks to screen their samples, and then if they are high for particular analytes that are of concern, this is where the communication with the projects really comes into play. If it's a decision analyte, a critical analyte, then you're going to want the best data possible for that analyte. You may not be as concerned about, possibly elevating limits of quantitation for other analytes. So you would have those conversations. So basically what you're doing is you're going to go down to small, in the case of fish tissue, you're just going to use a much smaller aliquot, right? But for, aqueous samples, you're going to end up making a dilution of the sample and then send it through the extraction process, with the thought being that you can do, if your analytes, your decision analytes, are the ones that are so high and require dilution, then those, the amount that's left in that container, that on the walls of the container, is inconsequential, because you're obviously blown well past your limits if you're having to dilute these samples for analysis at that point. So that's a very small amount of bias that you're introducing by not utilizing the entire sample. So that's really where we're going with it for treating the higher concentration samples.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Like I mentioned, I struggled with that a little bit last year. So just for a handful of project or two, but still, that was quite a nightmare, like you say, just super high concentrations moving through the entire system. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
I appreciate
that. It's really hard, because if you're giving folks a very long laundry list of analytes and saying, you have to meet this limit for all of these analytes, odds have it you're going to have a couple in the world of PFAS that are going to require dilution. And identifying those critical ones with a laboratory up front in the project is probably your best bet. And do it, providing them with some if-then statements on those analytes. That's kind of the best setup for success that I see, for a project.
And the other thing I'll add as an end user is it's this wasn't with CAT, this was with SGS Access. Kind of found out the hard way that we sent them some really high concentration samples, and it did cause some trouble. And since then, we've learned, and they've actually done this with us with PCBs also. Like what kind of range are you expecting? And that's, if you're commissioning analyses, that's a really good communication to have with your lab. What's your expected range? Because if you think it's likely that you might have a high concentration sample, if the lab knows that, they can start out cautiously and not cause themselves problems.
Yeah.
It would save a lot of time.
If you think it's going to be a high sample, take a smaller sample of that sample, a smaller volume of that sample, and send that with that sample to the laboratory so that they can screen it. Because once they extract it, they extract it. You're kind of, messing it up from the start if you wait until after extraction to evaluate the potential concentrations. There's the wax cartridges, the SPE cartridges have a limited capacity. If there's a lot of other co-contaminants, you can have those stay on those cartridges and take up space, so you're not gonna retain all your PFAS. There are a lot of things that can happen, and it's funny you say that because when I teach the ITRC sampling and analysis section, I stress communication with the laboratory on that is super critical. If you suspect any samples to being high, you need to let the laboratory know. A lot of people don't want to do that because they think they're giving something away or whatever to the laboratory, and you're not. You're really protecting yourself from having delays because they basically have contaminated or ruined all of your other samples because of a contamination issue, because that sample was high and extracted with a bunch of other samples that may not have been. And sometimes that's hard to determine, honestly, because it may not affect the method blank just randomly, but it may affect 3 other samples down the line in the extraction process. So yeah, it's super critical.
Hi, this is Jackie Fisher from EPA. I'm wondering, when is maybe you guys said it and I missed it, but when do you anticipate this method being, publicly available?
That's the $3 million question right now. Yeah, so the 1600 series, the way it's going right now is we've, done all the analysis for the single lab study. We're going through the validation process and the statistical, generating the stats on the method and creating the report to go along with all of the data to the EPA. What we really anticipate that to be to the EPA sometime this summer. After that point, it's up to the Office of Water how fast that can get out from their office. We have been giving them all of the data real time, and we actually have been working in hand with them with the draft method, the 1600 series format. And so we're really trying to shorten that time as much as possible by getting information to them earlier. Typically, you send everything all at once to them for a 1600 series method, but we wanted to kind of speed the process along. So we've been feeding them information as we have it. So, there's a very high likelihood that it will be published as a draft method following the single lab study, and not wait for the multi-lab study to be completed, which is fantastic. And the multi-lab study will most likely be starting sometime near the end of this summer.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
I had no idea how complicated the analysis was of this.
Yeah.
So, and
it really is, and the more complex the matrix, the harder everything gets. The sample prep is really more. You add more analytes, it gets more complicated. And you've got to think of it like a semi-VOA or a volatiles method, you know, A260 or A270, in that you can only optimize so much for a huge analyte list, especially with PFAS, where they all behave kind of wonky sometimes. Some of them behave wonky and don't really follow a pattern necessarily in their behavior. So it's, you know, it really is going to be a, you know, what can you live with on some of the analytes with recoveries and extraction efficiencies and such. But for the most part, I'd say they look pretty good.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And if anyone in the group, and there's a lot of different people on the group than normal, I think it's probably state lab people, but if they wanted to reach out to you or Mark, what do you recommend if they have specific questions?
I would just say send an email. I believe I had my email on the slides. But yeah, just you could send an email to me at janice.willie@navy.mil. And yeah, and I can easily, you know, be more than happy to talk with everybody.
That's great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.
All right. Any other questions?
This is Jesse. I was only able to join late, and you probably already mentioned this, but so this is going to be validated for tissues?
Yes. Yeah, we have a low lipid, a high lipid, low lipid and high lipid fish tissues and clams.
Okay, great. Yeah, because it was my understanding back when this got kicked out of the 8000 series that it was going to start off as a you know, additional water matrices beyond drinking water, and then they weren't doing tissues at that time.
Yeah, no, we threw the kitchen sink at it. The only thing, you know, and I wouldn't, you know, I would love to have been able to include some plants into this too, because that's, you know, another issue potentially that everyone's going to have to deal with. But that just made it, that was too late to the game I was too late to the game on that one. But yeah, we threw everything in there we could: biosolids, landfill leachate, everything.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you, Kat. Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Ali, for setting up the team session. And I'll be sending out a doodle poll fairly soon for our next meeting. So thanks very much and goodbye. Have a fine afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was excellent. Really
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.